The 10th chapter of Matthew, I trust you recall, deals with Jesus sending his people out to proclaim the gospel. It started with him sending out the 12 apostles, although it does look like Matthew here has appended a group of other statements that are related to combine them together so that we have one whole message compiled of a number of strands. Now, obviously, I can't say that with absolute certainty, but that does look like what he's done. Anyway, last week we noted that Jesus tells us that we must fear God, not men. And he did that by means of a comparison, because there's only so much that men can do to us. I mean, ultimately, they can kill the body, but there their power ends. That's the lot. Whereas in contrast, Jesus tells us that God, he can kill the body, and after that, he can throw us body and soul into hell. So he tells us that we're daft, foolish, if we fear men rather than fearing God. And even though, as he taught us, we go out as sheep among wolves, and we do face many dangers from every direction, there is a very important factor that we must keep in mind. And that factor is that despite the hatred of men and their sometimes fierce persecutions, it is still God who is in control. Now, in the opening verses that we read together this morning, in verses 29 through to 31 of chapter 10, the extent of God's control is laid out for us. And first of all, Jesus, he refers to a couple of sparrows. Now, sparrows are very common birds all around the world, except not so much in London, I understand these days. But they're everywhere. Everywhere you go, practically, you see sparrows. They're small and they're of next to no value. It says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing?" said Jesus. Now, some of you may not even remember what a farthing was. You can think of a 5p. This is a 5. Look, see even that small. This is a 5p. Now, granted, they used to be bigger. A 5p used to be that size, but 48 farthings made up one of those. So you can see the point is that Jesus is saying that a farthing had, whatever the actual coin itself was, would have been a Roman coin. It had very little purchasing power. But what it could do is it could buy 2 sparrows. So with that thought in mind, it could easily be thought that sparrows were irrelevant in the plans of God. However, what Jesus tells us is that not even one of those 2 sparrows could die apart from God's say-so. That's how Jesus says it. He said, cannot happen apart from your Father. So he's making sure there that we understand that this amazing providence, it's the providence of God. It's not some outworking of some distant and yet unknown law. He says it's our Father who is at work in this way. So clearly he's building to something that we should appreciate as very comforting. The fact that God is that much in control. And then he turns away from the detail in the world around us, from the sparrows, and he turns to the details of ourselves. He says, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Now, can you tell me the number of hairs that you have on your head? Well, of course you can't. Of course you can't. It's not doable. But Jesus is telling us that is the kind of detail that God knows about us. And you can see the picture he's painting there is that there's a certain number of hairs that belong on your head, And God ensures that that number is maintained according to his purposes. So we are being encouraged to take comfort from knowing this extent of God's providence, because the point is that you are of more value than many sparrows. If God holds the destiny of one sparrow that's worth next to nothing in his hands, and that nothing can happen to that sparrow apart from what God determines, how much more can we expect to be kept and upheld, even in the face of much hatred from our fellow man? Even in those circumstances, we need not be crippled by fear. And fear is a very crippling thing. But he says you need not fear. If you fear man, you're fearing altogether the wrong thing. Because nobody, absolutely nobody, can do anything to us unless God says so. Now, what we can't do is we can't take that to mean that no harm can ever befall us at the hands of wicked men, because Jesus says that that is exactly what can and in many circumstances will happen. But we can know that we are not simply at the mercy of the whims of wicked men. They are all held in check, as it were, by the overarching providence of God. And so we can even treat death with a certain amount of contempt, because there's a hymn we sing, I think, it basically says that we are in effect immortal until God says so. That now's your time to go. Death cannot touch us unless that is God's purpose. And so knowing that this scope then of God's providential care over his creation and over his people in particular, knowing that, he tells us that we must own him. Remember, this whole discourse is instruction to us as Christ's messengers, as those that Jesus sends out into the world. We are to be out then amidst the wolves proclaiming the gospel. We saw that last week. Now, we can't do that. We can't be out there sharing the gospel and living lives that show that the gospel means something to us, if at the same time we are trying to hide the fact that we belong to Jesus. We must be bold and courageous for him. And you know that even when Jesus walked this earth, he drew out those that had a kind of secret faith. You probably recall the woman that had the issue of blood for 12 years. She thought that she could just sneak up behind Jesus and could touch his cloak in the crowd and she would be healed. That's what she thought. But Jesus stopped and made it so that she had to come out and make herself known before the crowd. And perhaps a little less obvious then was Joseph of Arimathea, and that we are told specifically that he was a disciple, but secretly, it says, because he feared the ruling council. However, when Jesus was crucified, his secret was drawn out. He felt compelled to go to Pilate and to take ownership of the body so that he could give it a decent burial. You see, Jesus doesn't really support secret believism. Here, where he is telling us to go out into the world as his messengers, he lays it out more starkly. He says, whomsoever shall deny me before men, him will I also deny before my Father which is in heaven. That's a very stark message, that is, but I'm sure the greater weight of that command to confess me, to confess Jesus before men, I'm sure that does lie on teachers and leaders in the church, but there is no total exemption. As I said on another occasion, we are all called to be Christ's messengers, and so we must all, to some degree or another, confess him before men. We've all heard, probably, someone or other say to us or say to someone else that religion is a personal matter. And of course, we would agree that true biblical religion is personal insofar as that it affects us personally. But we know that when people like that say those words, what they mean is that you need to keep it to yourselves. Don't bother the rest of us with your personal thoughts. That's what people tend to mean when they say things like that these days. But Jesus tells us the exact opposite, doesn't he? No, he's not being harsh. He's not harsh. He even gives us encouragement that he will own us in heaven. But refusing to confess him before men is tantamount to denying the faith. If we are afraid of the opinion of men, we can hardly lay claim to believing that Jesus can save us. If we do not believe that he will protect us and keep us in the face of earthly danger, how can we believe that he will save us from the wrath of God against our sin? Well, as I said just now, the level of expectation is different for different people. There's a greater weight laid upon people like me. But some people, they've ruined their witness altogether by talking about Jesus, which sounds good, but they've been talking about Jesus while they should have been getting on with their work. That simply makes others believe that their religion is nothing but an excuse for laziness. So, wisdom is needed. I'm not suggesting otherwise. Wisdom is needed, and so we should pray for that wisdom, but for courage as well, so that we may know when it is proper to speak. But we should be bold. We should be bold. If fear is guiding us, we can be reasonably certain that it is guiding us wrong. So then, Jesus has shown us that as God is absolutely sovereign over all things, down to that smallest detail, we have no need to fear men despite their hostility and despite what it appears that they can do to us. But there is another outworking of this sovereignty, and this has an impact on our following and owning Jesus. Previously, Jesus has laid out for us that there will be many risks to us. We go about sharing the glad tidings among wolves, as we've said. But he said that even among members of our own family, there is the possibility that they would hand us over to authorities knowing that death would be the result. And like I said last week, that might sound over the top, but it's very much the thing that was going on in the Soviet Union in our lifetime. So it's not over the top just because we haven't experienced it here. And here now, Jesus is telling us that this is not just some random possibility. He says that he is the cause of such divisions. He says, look at it, it says, I came not to send peace, but a sword. He says, I am come to set a man at variance against his father and others in his family. And he says, a man's foes shall be they of his own household. And so that indicates to us that these things are very much a part of the plan and purpose of his coming. Now, I'm not pretending in any way it's easy to understand how that all works, but we can't pretend that it's not the case. But what we're not to do, we mustn't understand this as meaning that Jesus makes these people do the terrible things they do. He doesn't do that, not at all. But there can be no doubt in our minds that as God does have all things in his hands, then that must include the bad stuff that people may do to us. He determines how much they can do to us. They can do that and no more. If you were here for my sermons in Job, that's one of the primary lessons that we learned. But what we see here then is that Jesus he focuses in on the family. And that is quite understandable because there is nothing, generally speaking, that is more cherished than the family. I know that some people go so far as to say that there is nothing more important to them than their family. And family ties are that strong. Of course, the problem with saying that is that our affections, human affections, along with everything else, they weren't exempt from the effects of the fall. No, they were as affected as every other part of us. And because the fall meant we lost communion with God as a result of our sin, well, next down the line, if I can put it like that, for our affections, are people, especially those closest to us. And so what happens is family very often takes the place of God. And so those that follow Christ, he said, you need to put that right. Even though Christ may be the cause of divisions within families, still Jesus must come first. He's not telling us to lay aside all human affections. He doesn't forbid us discharging our duties in our various relationships. Husbands must love their wives. Children must honour their parents, etc. But what Jesus is desiring of us is that all the mutual love that exists in our various relationships one to another, that it is regulated as to give God the highest rank. And that is what he's teaching us here. He says, he that loveth father and mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Now, of course, it's easy to assent to that, but do you find it difficult to put into practice? When the two collide, which one wins out? Remember the acronym JOY. Joy, nice word. Joy. Jesus first, others second, yourself last. Jesus first. How easy is that to say? But often we fail when push comes to shove, as the saying goes. But there is a cost to discipleship. And that's something else that Jesus draws out for us here. We are to faithfully follow him, count him greater than all else, even though there is a potential cost in doing so. He says, and he that taketh not his cross and followeth after me is not worthy of me. Now we have to be very clear about that. We cannot do anything whatsoever to earn our way into God's favour. We can't purchase our salvation. That is way beyond our abilities. We must never think of any of the commands of God in such a light. A Christian is a person that has been saved by Christ. We do now live in the newness of life, but of course that newness of life is at variance with the world. But that variance, it doesn't allow us not to live in the newness of life. We are expected and required to continue to live for Christ, even if that should come at great cost to ourselves. That can mean that we cannot be considered his disciples and so saved people unless we are prepared to endure many afflictions. The cross, as I'm sure you know, was an emblem of death. And in Jesus' time, someone that was convicted to death, they had to carry their own cross to the place of execution. It was, of course, a heavy and burdensome thing. And so we're taught then that we are not to be ashamed of the cross, and even more particularly that we should embrace it despite the difficulties that come with it. We are to own the fact that we have died with Christ. We have died to the world. There is nothing here that can entice us to stay longer than our service requires us to. Now, if God has been pleased to grant us comforts in this world, and let's be fair, that's all of us. If God has been pleased to grant us these comforts, they must not be allowed to blind us to the reality that there is a cost to following Jesus. Preachers of the health and wealth gospel may kid you that you only have wonderful things to look forward to, in the sense that, well, you'll become rich if you enrich them on the way, and you'll never be ill again. But Jesus, he tells us exactly otherwise. So I just said, the cross speaks of burdens and death. And if we find that all too difficult to bear, he continues, he that findeth his life shall lose it. He that loseth his life for my sake shall find it. So you've got the image there then of someone desperately trying to keep hold of the life that they have built for themselves here. But no matter how much they have, and no matter how well they have defended that lifestyle, death will still take them away. They're said to lose their life because when that day comes, as it most definitely and inevitably will, it will bring them everlasting ruin. We can even say that, while they're alive, they're not truly living. I know that, when we go on holiday to some exotic destination and we lie on some gorgeous beach, or perhaps we go somewhere and we enjoy those white-knuckle thrill rides. In those kind of circumstances, we do tend to say, well, this is living. Yet those moments, though they are very enjoyable, they are transitory. They pass, as with everything. And that is why truly living is to be in a relationship with Jesus Christ. He said himself, and this is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. Knowing God through Jesus Christ is not transient. It truly is everlasting life, because it is life with God. But if we are willing to forego any advantages that may be available in this life, and instead be willing to lay ourselves open to all the loathing and animosity that the world may throw at us, well then we shall find that whatever the world takes from us, we receive back and abundantly more too. Now, much of that is obviously in the next life. People are too wrapped up with what they can get in this life. But of course, you might be thinking, why are you telling us all about the burdens and problems of being a disciple of Christ? You might think, don't you want people to be added to the church? Telling them how hard it will be isn't going to endear them to the gospel. But there are a couple of things that we can say to that. And first of all, Jesus told us these things. I didn't make them up when I was preparing this sermon. And as Jesus was very candid about this, I doubt very much that he would be pleased if I were to lie to you about the situation. And if he was confident that speaking in such a way would draw his people to himself, can we then do any less? Do we think that we can do better than him? The reality is that honesty must always prevail. Even if we know that people would rather hear a more palatable message, we must still be truthful. We must be honest. But what we can say, the other thing that we can say, is that it is not all doom and gloom. That would be a real travesty to suggest such a thing. As Jesus just said, he that loseth his life for my sake shall find it. In the last few verses of this 10th chapter of Matthew, Jesus goes on to speak in terms of rewards. First of all, he says, "He that receiveth you receiveth me, and he that receiveth me receiveth him that sent me." So, first of all, we stand in a very privileged position. We stand in his place, as it were. Now, even in this world, people don't just let anybody represent them. Representatives have to go through a pretty serious vetting process. And yet we stand in the place of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He takes ordinary, regular people like you and me, and he puts us in this real honourable station. Now make no mistake, if Christ does that for you now, he will see that you are glorified. And then, like I say, he goes on at the very end of this chapter to speak in terms of rewards. And if you read those verses, you can see that he descends, from a prophet, and then he speaks of a righteous person, and then just to a regular disciple. And trying to allocate someone or something specific to each of those, I think, would be difficult, and we'd end up getting lost in the details. So the best way to understand this is to simply understand that whoever listens to us receives something in line with what they have heard and accepted. And Jesus makes sure that none of us can think that we have nothing to offer. He says, "And whosoever shall give to drink unto one of these little ones a cup of cold water only in the name of a disciple, verily I say unto you, he shall in no way lose his reward." And we can see from that God is a God that readily gives. He gives out these rewards. You may recall in the letter to the Hebrews in the 11th chapter, that's the chapter that speaks at some length about faith, and it says in verse 6 of that chapter, "But without faith it is impossible to please him, for he that cometh to God must believe that he is," so you've got to believe that he's there in the first place, "and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him." So that you can see the very essence of true faith must include the idea that God is a rewarder. And that's exactly what Jesus is teaching here toward the end of Matthew chapter 10. And the greatest reward for those that follow Jesus is the forgiveness of their sin and eternal life. Now again, that is what it says, but we mustn't draw from that. We mustn't think that there is some way that we can merit a place in heaven, that we, by our own strength, that we can be good enough. But what we do see, the one thing we do see, is that there is nothing greater available to anybody than eternal life. And that this is exactly what God freely gives to all those that follow Jesus, irrespective of the cost that there may be to themselves in this world. And so then, I heartily recommend you look upon this world as it really is. In our island, it may look like all the pleasures are at your disposal, but they're not. And for some they might be, but they're transitory, they're past. They're in effect here today and gone tomorrow. So look upon this world as it really is and put Jesus first. Be prepared to suffer all kinds of things for his sake, knowing that it is he that's in control of everything. Now, as I've said, you and I experience lots of good stuff, lots of comforts in this world. These things that Jesus has told us to be prepared to suffer, we don't tend to have to face those things. There's no guarantee that we will never have to face them. We have to be prepared. And our preparation must be in the fact that we know that our God is in control. As Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely, for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. Amen.